Hello, come in. Hi, come in. Nice to have you back up in the study. It's been a while. You'll have to excuse the chaos. I've been trying to keep this one a bit tidier because it's smaller, but when this happens, when this great sea of books and papers that's kind of washing tide of it begins to accumulate around the island of my chair, it's actually not so much a sign of chaos as of cosmos. It's a sign of labour. It's the fact that I'm doing stuff and putting stuff together. And I've had a big rush recently of talks I needed to do. I did talk about dragons and dinosaurs in the presence of a dinosaur in Norwich Cathedral. I'm working on a talk. This is a fantastic collection of posthumously published essays by Dorothy Sayers. I bought it second-hand. It's got the most brilliant essay, which is about Dante and Traherne, and I'm giving a talk about it to the Traherne Society. This also, here's interesting, look. This book was published posthumously to Dorothy Sayers in 1963. Copyright Anthony Fleming, 1963, herself, of course. Look, here is a review of it by C.S. Lewis, pasted in. The last thing Lewis wrote, because he died in 63, of course. Completed shortly before his death on November the 22nd. Anyway, so I've been reading that, and also I've been working on a thing for the Rabbit Room in Nashville. So anyway, I still sometimes sit down with the pipe and a pint and a poem. Three good things starting with P, because you need to refresh yourself. So I was recently, for some reason I was back in touch, maybe it was on a Zoom or something, or it was a poetry reading of his, with the Irish poet Micheal O Siadhail. Amazing poet. It's spelt like this, it's like O Siadhail, but it's actually pronounced O Siadhail. He's a really first-rate poet, and he's recently produced his masterwork, which is a big sequence, overarching sequence of sonnets and haikus called the Five Quintets, which is a kind of poetic account of the whole of modernism and the history of the last 300 years. Pretty amazing. Anyway, I've been reading his poetry for a long time, and one of the things that Micheal O Siadhail does best is write about music. I mean, music is extremely difficult to write about precisely because it's not words. He writes about the experience of listening to it. He writes about what it suggests. He writes about what the structure of music itself holds and carries for the mind. And the kind of music that he writes about best, which is the kind that he loves, is jazz. And I thought I'd read you, I think, one of his very best poems, which is called Cosmos. I mean, it's a poem about listening to a traditional jazz combo playing variations on a jazz standard in smoky New Orleans club. That's what it's apparently about. But it's not called that. It's not called jazz in the club. It's called Cosmos, which is a very big word. I talked about chaos and cosmos at the beginning. Cosmos, order, pattern, beauty, form, arising out of chaos, which is the opposite of cosmos. It has cosmic reaches, and anyway, you'll see, it's just the most amazing poem. It happens to start with the saxophone player in the quartet going, all right. And I love the sound of the saxophone. I don't play it myself. I always felt actually this particular Peterson pipe shape is a Sherlock Holmes original. I was rather like a saxophone. And I think this is a very, very fine poem, Cosmos. All right, booms the saxophone man, everybody feeling chameleon. The combo expands the tune of a well-battered song. An opulence of sound, clash and flow, as a spotlight tunnels dust in its beam. Glints the trumpet's bell, and the hall turns hot and hybrid, beery listeners swaying and bobbing the mood of the theme. From rainbows of timbre, a strand of colour floats into the air. The trumpet solo, burping one phrase of a melody, ripe and brassy and buttoned down, as though a song is breathing over its origins. Those 4 hot-blooded notes weeping their pleasure again in an old Civil War bugle. A sleazy back room in New Orleans. Sax and rhythm. The brightness of a reed, winding tube and crook are working on another hue of the tune that moves into its own discourse. Bud Freeman, Johnny Hodges, Charlie Parker. All right, he drawls, then scats a little as we clap a tradition of subversions. But he's off again. I watch swarms of dust in the spotlight, swirls of galaxies, and imagine he's blowing a huge balloon of space that's opening our world of order. In a waft of creation, his being becomes a music's happening. A red-shirted pianist now leans to seize a gene of the song, which seems to veer and improvise, somehow catching a moment's shifts and humours. Hail, Madam Jazz. Let the theme return, its mutants echoing as a tune balances against its freedom. One key, so open-toned and open-stitched, a beat poised, a cross-grained rhythm interplays, imprecations of voice over voice, mutinies of living are rocking the steady state of a theme. These riffs and overlappings, a love of deviance, our genesis in noise. I mean, what an amazing poem. I mean, it does the first thing it needs to do, which is to take you there to that sleazy back room in New Orleans and get you to hear the music and see the images and that beautiful sort of idea of tunes and melodies as like strands picked out of a rainbow and interwoven. It does all of that really well. But of course, poetry is always doing more than one thing at the same time. And I think both is what it is and it is what it suggests. It is what it becomes a metaphor. A metaphor is something that carries meaning over from one place to another. And so you kind of reread this poem and notice it's called Cosmos. And notice that the last line contains the word Genesis. And you suddenly realize that this experience of the freedom to improvise within given things, the creativity of the jazz musicians, and somehow through them Jazz herself, Madam Jazz, as he says, working through all of them to make this beautiful new thing happen, which is a series of variations on things, that becomes an image for creation itself, and not just the once-off creation of in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but the continuing unfolding of creation. There's a wonderful thing about genes and variations. But notice that line about as though a song is breathing over its origin. That's a clear riff on, and I use the word riff carefully there, it's a jazz riff. It's a clear riff on the line in Genesis. And, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. Spirit, of course, means breath, as though a song were breathing over its origins. And the 4 notes being endlessly combined. Later on, he talks about seizing the gene of a song, and you think about DNA and the 4 letters and the endless interplaying of them, and the letters are like notes. So it's a celebration of improvisation, and therefore it's a celebration about the relationship between order, the given, the original tune, the trad tune that's being played, and freedom and variation. The jazz happens precisely when you know the original tune, and then you're free to play a variation on it. And the variation only becomes meaningful because you know the original tune. And so that I love the bit where he says, he scats, all right, he draws. All right, of course, all right is, and God saw that it was good, it was very good. All right, he draws, then scats a little, as we clap a tradition of subversions. That's absolutely brilliant. Of course, subversion is a technical way of talking about something you can do with a chord. But you can see jazz as a tradition of subversions. You have the standard and then somebody plays it differently, and because they played it differently, it becomes a new thing. All of this is about the emergence of order out of chaos, cosmos out of chaos. And it becomes, in the end, a kind of hymn of praise. Let the theme return, its mutants echoing as a tune balances against its freedom. Freedom consisting not of an extremity, but of a balance between what's given and what can be made new. It's a wonderful thing. And then he brings in this, perhaps there's just a lot of his poetry talks about the relationship between creation and redemption, and he thinks, he's a Christian poet, he thinks a lot about the meaning of the cross. It's just there slightly, a beat poised, a cross-grained rhythm that's somehow written into the pattern of creation is this pattern of God's self-giving, of dying to rise again, the old tune dying and the new tune being born. And yet it's all a beautiful invocation of jazz. Of course, it does that lovely thing, which I particularly like, where he says, I watch swarms of dust in the spotlight, swirls of galaxies. I'm sure you've thought that too. I've often thought it, that the shaft of sunlight, or in this case the spotlight, comes, and the dust you seldom see, as Leonard Cohen says, suddenly swirls and moves, and you think about those great nebula clouds that you see from the Hubble Space Telescope. The shift in perspective from the little back room to the whole cosmos, and then back to the little back room again. It's just the sort of thing poetry does really well. I think it's a very fine poem. One among many fine poems in the book, of course. The title of the book, Hail Madam Jazz, is a phrase from the poem I've just read you. So if you didn't know Micheal O Siadhail, I commend him. Really, I ought to have had a jazz band playing behind me while I did all this, but we can't have everything. Anyway, cheers.